Good evening. I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to our first Third Thursday program of the year. I see many of you have been here with us before, and we're so grateful for your continued support during the last year. Yeah, you stuck with us through the pandemic and then the derecho, and hopefully that's the end of the drama as we look forward to 2021 to be an outstanding year with lots of exciting events to come. I'd like to encourage you to regularly check our website and Facebook page, as well as those of the Hoover Presidential Library Museum, the Hoover Historic Site, and of course your favorite public library for special program offerings that'll pop up in the months ahead. In fact, we have online programs every month this year for you to enjoy, including some special programs hosted by members of the Hoover family. Earlier today, we had Margaret Hoover along with Hoover historian George Nash and CNN analyst John Avlon talking about our first 100 days and the history of that, stretching back into when Herbert Hoover started. So if you could watch your emails for about those programs, that'd be terrific. I also want to tell you about two other programs that are coming up in the next few months. First, we're accepting nominations for our Uncommon Public Service Award among state legislators. The Uncommon Public Service Award was created to honor those public servants who demonstrate uncommon service to the people of Iowa above and beyond their legislative responsibilities. Just visit our website under the Grants and Awards tab right at the top and enter your nominations for a state representative, a state senator, or both. The deadline is March 1st. The other program I'd like to tell you about is especially exciting because we will deliver over $60,000 in scholarship funding to 15 Iowa high school juniors who create and run a community service oriented project of their own design next year. The 15 finalists will each earn $1,500 and 4 of them will earn an additional $10,000 in scholarships each. It's called the Uncommon Student Awards, and it's only for Iowa high school juniors who apply by March 15th. You can also find the details under the Grants and Awards tab on our website or visit uncommonsstudent.org for more details. That's uncommonsstudent.org. I hope you'll tell everyone you know about these two great programs. As for this program this evening, we invite you to enter questions at any time during the program through the Q&A feature you'll find along the edge of your screen. You may also vote for questions someone else has entered if you'd also like to hear those answered. As we may not have time to answer all the questions provided, top vote getters will be asked first. Tonight's presentation is called The Origins of the Presidential Cabinet. The timing is perfect as we're now in day 2 of a new Joseph Biden presidency, and our host will walk us through some things we might expect to see going forward on that. Our speaker today and is going to give a historical perspective on presidential cabinets is Dr. Lindsay Chervinski. Dr. Chervinsky is serving as a scholar in residence at the Institute for the Thomas Paine Studies at Iona College and is a senior fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies. Previously, she was a historian at the White House Historical Association, which is a fantastic organization. She's the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of the American Institution. We're cabinet making with President Biden is we're seeing a lot of confirmation hearings right now, and Dr. Chervinsky will give us a great background and history of how we got here today with the presidential cabinet. Dr. Chervinsky, it's a pleasure to have you here this evening.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to join you all via Zoom. I have to confess, I was really looking forward to visiting in person because I've actually never been to Iowa. It's one of my states that I have not crossed off my map yet. So when all of this is over, I'm going to go do a tour of every place I was supposed to visit. And that will just have to be my pandemic, post-book tour or something like that. But I'm very grateful to all of you for logging in. I know there's a lot of online content these days, and so I'm grateful you have selected to make this event your entertainment for tonight. So My goal is to share a little bit with you about the origins of the cabinet, how Washington created it, how it developed a little bit over the next 2 centuries. And then I'm eager to leave time for questions at the end. I always think that the question and answer portion of the night is the most fun because I want to know what you want to know about, and I want to be able to answer those questions. So please don't be shy. Please put in your questions throughout the talk. It won't distract me, and then we can chat at the end. So, any conversation about the cabinet and the origins and Washington must start at the Constitutional Convention, which took place in Philadelphia in 1787. And the reason our conversation has to start there is because the cabinet actually isn't in the Constitution. And that was very intentional and by design. The delegates to the convention had just lived through the revolution, and they had very good memories about why they had done so. And they blamed the British cabinet for actually instigating the conflict. They thought that the British cabinet had corrupted the king and was a source of corruption and cronyism and had obscured transparency at the highest levels of government. So they actually rejected several proposals for different types of executive councils, including one that looked almost identical to the cabinet that Washington ended up creating. And I would encourage you to note Washington's very prominent place in this painting. He's standing on the dais, and he's, of course, the tallest one in the painting. That's intentional and appropriate because he was the president of the convention. He did not miss a single session. He was there every day. He heard what the delegates had to say. He heard them reject these proposals. And then after the official workday was done, he would drink tea, have dinner, go riding, go to the theater, go dancing, listen to music. And usually he was accompanied by at least a couple, if not several delegates, many of whom were his close friends. Now, we don't really have a record of what they talked about, but my guess is the day's events and the debates were probably a topic of conversation. All of which is to say, Washington had a very good idea of what was expected of the first president, and he knew that if the Constitution was ratified, he was going to be the first president. So he had a very good idea of what was expected of him. Now, the delegates were reasonable men. They understood that no person can be expected to govern by themselves or to have all of the answers. So they did put 2 options into the Constitution in Article 2 to provide support and advice for the president, and both of those are actually still in the Constitution. So the first is the clause in Article 2 that says that the president, with the advice and consent of the Senate, will make certain appointments and foreign treaties. Now, in the 21st century, we tend to think of that clause as sort of a rubber stamp, and the Senate either accepts or rejects whatever treaties the president makes independently. But that was very much not how this clause was intended. In fact, everyone expected that the Senate would actually be a council of foreign affairs and would very quite literally advise on foreign policy. And that kind of actually made sense at the time because when the Senate first convened in 1789, there were actually only 22 people. So it wasn't like it was a 100-person council trying to provide advice. Additionally, because at the time senators were selected by their state legislatures, the delegates really thought that they would be safe advisors. And I say that sort of in parentheses because they assumed that the states would pick people who were smart, knowledgeable, experienced, and capable of giving good advice. They also assumed that the states would remove those senators if they advocated bad policies or if they weren't good advisors. So that seemed like a really good option to ensure that the president was hearing from the right sort of people. And Washington fully expected that to be the case. In fact, when he took office in April of 1789, at the very end of April, he knew that foreign policy was going to be one of the first things he had to tackle. And pretty much right away, he started planning for his first visit to the Senate, which took place in August. He met with a committee of senators to figure out some of the small details like where would he sit and how would he be introduced and where would John Adams, who was the president of the Senate in his capacity as vice president, sit. All of the sort of small, silly details that seem unnecessary until you have to do something for the first time and you realize just how many decisions there actually are to be made. So he met with that committee, and then he shared all of the existing treaties with Native American nations and the United States with the Senate, because what he wanted to talk about was this upcoming peace commission. And he had to send commissioners to this event and give them advice. And he wanted to know basically what advice he should give them. So he sent all of the Native American treaties so that the Senate could review them ahead of time and sort of see what had already been established. He let them know officially when he was coming. And on the day of his arrival, he also brought with him Acting Secretary of War Henry Knox, who had overseen a lot of those treaties and could provide input and feedback and answer any questions that the senators might have. Now, when Washington arrived, he had a prepared address and he had a list of questions that he wanted the senators to respond to. So he delivered the address, he asked the questions, and he was met with silence. Some senators sort of avoided eye contact, others sort of shuffled their papers and tried to appear busy, but no one spoke for several minutes. And finally, Senator William McClay of Pennsylvania stood up and suggested that they refer the issue to committee so that they could discuss it privately and in more detail, and asked Washington to come back the following week. It's kind of hard to imagine the Senate responding to the president that way today. Needless to say, Washington was not pleased because this was not the sort of immediate feedback he needed. And so he stood up and he yelled, "This defeats every purpose of my being here." Except, he's much taller and he's much bigger and he's much scarier because this is the most famous man in the world and he's yelling at you. So the senators were, quite taken aback. Washington did gather his composure and he agreed to come back the following week, but the damage was really done. And on the way out, he reportedly said that he would never again return for advice. Now, whether or not he actually said that is kind of hard to prove, but he definitely was thinking it because he never again returned for advice. So just a couple of months into his presidency, he's already dismissed one of the key options that had been laid out for him to obtain advice, basically as too inefficient and cumbersome to provide the sort of feedback and support that diplomacy required. So the second option is also in Article 2, and it says that the president may require in writing the opinions of the department secretaries about the issues pertaining to their departments. And this was very carefully crafted. So first of all, the president may require. He is not obligated to require, and he doesn't have to listen to the advice of the secretaries. That's really essential. Second, the advice is supposed to be in writing, and that was put in place to ensure that there would be a paper trail of evidence about who said what and who advocated which position so that people could be held accountable when they made bad choices. That was one of the real concerns that a lot of delegates had about the British cabinet. It was that every meeting took place behind closed doors. There were no minutes, and they didn't know basically who was responsible and who to vote out of office or to censure for a bad choice. So this was a very carefully crafted clause. And Washington also intended to follow this quite carefully. He started by writing letters back and forth to the department secretaries. But even today, when we're sending text messages or emails, sometimes things aren't totally clear based on the tone, or we might have a follow-up question and we end up with a really long string of messages that are kind of hard to follow. So now imagine trying to do that with parchment and quill. You have to write out your letter, you have to wait for it to dry, you have to wait for it to be delivered, then you have to wait for that same process to take place on the other end and for the letter to come back to you. And then what happens if you have follow-up questions? So Washington also quickly determined that the issues that were facing the government were really complex, and it was really hard to deal with them in writing alone. So these are this one on the top here was where Washington spent most of his time when the seat of government was in New York City in 1789 and early in 1790. The picture on the right is where President Washington stayed when he was in Philadelphia, the president's house, and the seat of government moved there in November of 1790. Unfortunately, that house no longer exists. So I've recreated it using this 3D model to show you a little bit sort of what the house was like and how big it was and sort of all the different pieces that were put on. But this is where Washington did the majority of his presidential leading, basically, his governing. And he started, when he was here, what he started to do was to amend his relationship with the secretaries. He would send a letter and they would send one back, but then they would come and they would meet with him and sort of hash out any remaining details or any edits that needed to be handled or any revisions, that kind of thing. And when he would meet with them, he would usually meet in his private study, which was on the second floor of that building I just showed you. This is roughly what it would have looked like. It was a pretty small room, about 15 by 21 feet. It was quite smushed, full of furniture. This picture doesn't do a great job of showing just how full it actually was. There were at least 3 bookcases, Washington's very large desk, which was at least 5 feet wide. There was his dressing table and his globe and his mirror, and there was an iron stove in one corner. So this was a very small, multi-purpose, personal space. So Washington had his one-on-one consultations with the secretaries in this space for about 2.5 years. And that's really important to emphasize because Washington didn't actually convene the first cabinet meeting until November 26, 1791. And that demonstrates to us that Washington did not intend to create the cabinet from day one, and it was not inevitable. In fact, it was the pressures of office that compelled Washington to feel like he needed this group support, and that one-on-one consultations were frankly insufficient. So just in case you all don't recognize who these guys are, I hope my head is not covering Edmund Randolph. But from left to right, there's of course President George Washington, Secretary of War Henry Knox, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. Now, when I talk about cabinet meetings, I usually use the phrase the secretaries, just sort of a group clumping mechanism. Technically, the Attorney General didn't have a division. The Department of Justice wasn't created until 1870, and so that position was considered technically less on the same level as the others. But Washington did not view Randolph that way. And in fact, he was really insistent upon getting his opinion just as much as the others. So I tend to treat them as one group because that's what Washington did as well. So Washington has a cabinet. What is he supposed to do with it? There had been no previous cabinets, and he didn't really have any model to follow. So he had to figure out how he was going to manage these interactions. And like most people, he borrowed from his previous experiences, and his previous leadership experiences were largely war-based. When Washington was commander-in-chief, he regularly held a council of war before making almost any large decision. They consisted of his officers and his aides-de-camp, and it was a really great way for him to get advice, to try and build consensus, and also to get political cover for controversial decisions like a big retreat or abandoning the city of Manhattan. Sometimes he met with his councils in very fancy homes like the Longfellow House up top in Cambridge, which still exists. And sometimes he met with his councils in his campaign war tent. And this tent actually is still available at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. If you have the opportunity to see it, I highly recommend doing so. It was a very large tent for the time, but it was still a tent. And so that meant that bugs could come in and out, smells could come in and out. When weather was bad, you knew it. It was probably very muddy and dirty. There were dogs and horses everywhere. And it was a very, very cramped space. One small little fun fact about the tent that I think is great. Washington was so tall that they actually had to add extra fabric to raise the level of the entrance because the standard height was so uncomfortable for him to have to come in and out all the time. So just a little fun fact about that. So when Washington gathered his officers, these were not wallflowers. These were not people with small personalities. They had egos and ambitions and ideas about what should be happening. They expected to be heard and listened to. And so it was not an easy feat to manage these various people. So Washington used a couple of strategies to make sure he heard from everyone, to make sure they felt involved, and to try and keep people on track. So first, he would usually send out a list of questions ahead of time, and that would give the officers a sense of what he wanted to talk about and how to prepare. He would then use that list of questions as the meeting agenda. And this was important because some of the officers were a little bit louder than others and more prone to diversions and off-topic conversations. Then, if the officers disagreed, he would ask for written opinions. And this was an essential part of his leadership because it allowed him to make sure that first, he had all of the information. Second, that he understood what people were saying and that he allowed every single person to be heard. So maybe on any given day, one of the officers didn't really feel like going 12 rounds with Charles Lee and the hounds that he brought with him to every meeting and who were quite raucous. And so if a quieter officer wanted to make a different point, Washington could hear it. It allowed Washington to make decisions in his own time. He liked to really ponder the details before making a final choice. And it also gave Washington written evidence that his officers had agreed with whatever choice he decided on, which was really important for things like retreats. So, for example, in the summer of 1776, when Washington ordered a series of retreats across Long Island and then Manhattan and finally into New Jersey, he convened a council of war meeting every night before ordering a retreat. And then he would send Congress a report of the discussion of the council of war, even though they hadn't asked for it, just to make sure everyone knew that all of the officers had been in agreement that this was the right call, even if it was very unpopular at the time. So when Washington brought together his secretaries several years later when he was president and they were gathering again in this small space, he used the same strategies. He would send letters out ahead of time. He would use those questions as his agenda, and he would request written opinions if the secretaries disagreed, which frankly, as the years went on, was more often than not. As any fans of Hamilton the musical will know, Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson really quite despised each other. He also used cabinet meetings for the same purpose. He wanted to get advice, he wanted to build consensus, and he wanted to have political cover. Now, Washington never publicized the written opinions that his department secretaries wrote for him, like he did sometimes with the Council of War deliberations, but he did have them in his back pocket just in case he needed them. So one great example of how the cabinet functioned occurred in 1793 when there's an event called the Neutrality Crisis. In February of 1793, France declared war on Great Britain, and that war quickly became an international conflict and brought in all of their allies and enemies and colonial holdings. But the United States really could not afford to go to war. The country was just beginning to recover from the revolution financially, environmentally, economically, emotionally, physically. So there was just, war was not in the cards, especially because the government didn't have a navy or army anyway. So even if they had wanted to fight, they didn't have anything with which to fight. And while we do remember Jefferson as being a very pro-French person, he even agreed that war was not an option. So on the far left, there's an image of Washington's Proclamation of Neutrality, which he put out in April of 1793. And he started to gather the cabinet quite regularly. And actually 1793 was the high watermark for cabinet meetings in Washington's administration. They met 51 times, up to 5 times per week, sometimes several hours per day. Most of those meetings took place in the summer in Philadelphia, in this room. So you can imagine what that would have felt like. And at this point, to Jefferson and Hamilton, as I said, they despised each other. So I'm sure that the atmosphere of the meetings must have been just lovely. So as I said, so the left there is the Proclamation of Neutrality. The gentleman in the center is Citizen Edmond Charles Genet. And he was the new French minister to the United States who came over and landed just about a week after Washington had issued his proclamation. And he had very different ideas about what the United States should do, and basically disregarded everything that Washington and Jefferson as Secretary of State had to say. And he set up a series of basically building grounds for his privateers. Now, privateers were private ships that were sailing under a letter of marque, or basically a license from a foreign government. And what Genet did is he would purchase, or he would capture, or he would seize a ship. He would outfit it as basically a warship. And then he would hire American captains to go sail it on behalf of France, attack British ships, and then drag those British ships back into port, sell off all the goods, and make a new privateer. This was very common practice in the 18th century. It was sort of standard warfare. etiquette. Everyone did it to try and build out their naval resources without actually having to build out their navy. The problem was he was doing that in American ports. And you can imagine how the British felt about seeing British captured ships dragged into American ports. It's kind of hard to think of the Americans as neutral. Now, this is a map of Philadelphia in the how it would have looked in the 1790s. The blue star on the left was where Washington's house was, the president's house, that picture I showed you. And the blue star on the right is where the port was. And Genet was conducting these privateering activities in the port of Philadelphia, 6 blocks from Washington's house. So as I said, it did not go unnoticed by either Washington or the British minister, who also lived in Philadelphia. And the cabinet basically had to decide what to do about this. And so Washington gathered the cabinet over the summer, and in particular in August of 1793, and they decided to request the recall of citizen Edmond Charles Genet from France. And that was a huge moment because the United States had never requested the recall of a foreign minister, and they frankly weren't sure how France was going to respond. And when France responded positively and agreed to recall Genet, it was a tacit acknowledgement that the United States had the right to set its own foreign policy and the right to demand that foreign ministers respect it. And the cabinet was integral in every single step of that decision-making process. Now, what do I have here? As the presidency wore on, Washington actually did continue to evolve his cabinet practices. He determined once his initial sort of team, this team, where are they? This team, once they started to resign, he had to get replacements. And so Thomas Jefferson left at the end of 1793. Henry Knox left at the end of 1794. Hamilton left at the end of January 1795, and Edmund Randolph resigned in August of 1795 as well. So towards the end of Washington's presidency, he didn't have any of his initial guys. And I affectionately refer to their replacements as the B team, because Washington, frankly, really didn't think they were up to snuff. He didn't want to consult with them as much. He didn't want to have full cabinet meetings. He preferred one-on-one consultations, written advice, or even consulting with people that were no longer in the administration. So he determined that it was really essential that the cabinet be a flexible institution such that each president can use it however they see best and however they need in any given moment. So what worked for him in one year wasn't necessarily going to work in another or for a future president. And that was really essential because it established the principle that cabinet secretaries do not have a right to be a part of the decision-making process. The president can ask for their input and they can offer it, but the president is not obligated to listen. So Washington really established, presidential authority over the secretaries, and that they really belonged and reported to the president as opposed to they were not partners. The last thing that Washington established, and bear with me for a second, because initially this might seem confusing. Washington put together a very diverse cabinet. Now, of course, the 4 guys that he had in his initial administration were all white dudes. This is very true. But white men were the only people that were considered citizens at the time. So the candidate pool was really quite small. And Washington selected people from different geographic regions, from different backgrounds, from different economic statuses, from different, cultural or economic factions and interests. And people and his contemporaries really understood that this was the message he was trying to send. He wanted to make sure the entire country was represented in his administration and felt an emotional tie to someone in the executive branch, especially because the government was so new and he was trying to build up emotional connections and loyalties to this new institution and this new government. So those 3 precedents are ones that by and large have really continued to stand the test of time since 1789. There are, of course, some aberrations, but by and large, there has been those 3 common threads. So I just want to sort of go through a couple of cabinets in history and talk a little bit also about how Hoover fits into this calculation. and then I'll leave time for questions. So when I think about a cabinet and when I'm evaluating a cabinet, I'm not evaluating whether or not I agree with their policies, but whether the cabinet and the administration works effectively to pursue those policies. So a great example is Jefferson. On the left here is Jefferson's cabinet. He had the least turnover of any administration. They got along very well. They served as brilliant coalition managers to do congressional outreach, to persuade, to do foreign policy. But one of the policies that they did put in place was the embargo of 1807, which was a complete disaster. It absolutely tanked the economy. It put the United States in worse defensive position against Great Britain and really did sort of accelerate the beginning of the War of 1812. But they did a really good job pursuing it. So it's a great cabinet, just bad policy. So I just want to make sure I'm explaining how I go about evaluating these things. So there are lots of examples of really bad cabinets, to be honest. It's much easier to have a bad cabinet than to have a good cabinet. It's very, very difficult to manage all these people with different ideas and ambitions and egos, and they're often rivals, or maybe they're your rival. So things can go bad much easier than things can go good. But 3 examples I like to highlight. The one up top is Andrew Jackson's cabinet. Andrew Jackson actually went through basically 3 complete revolutions of cabinet personnel before he could find a group of people willing to say yes to whatever he wanted to do. So that amount of turnover and the scandals that accompanied that kind of turnover is generally not a very good thing to have for your administration. It undermines your ability to put forth legislation and pursue policies. And the best cabinet is the one that is not noticed. Good cabinets don't show up in the news. All of their successes go towards the president. When a cabinet has a lot of scandal or things go badly, then we really notice. The one on the bottom right is Andrew Johnson's cabinet. Andrew Johnson kept Lincoln's cabinet, which is a very bad idea. Generally, when there is a turnover, it's a good thing for a president to have their own cabinet secretaries. They have better relationships that way, and they can ensure that they are loyal to them and their administration. In fact, Johnson's relationship with his cabinet is what led to his impeachment when he tried to fire his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. So if your cabinet leads to your impeachment, that's generally not a good sign. The last one is John F. Kennedy's cabinet. And the reason I put Kennedy in sort of the bad group is because he had so many different groups of people that he consulted with. He had his kitchen cabinet, and then he had his official cabinet. And when there is no clarity about who is actually in charge and who's has the ear of the president and who is calling the shots, that can lead to a lot of internal confusion among the various bureaucracies of the executive branch. So it's generally really a good thing when there's a clear hierarchy. There are some cabinets that have a bit of a mixed record. So John Adams is known for having a pretty notoriously terrible cabinet in the beginning. He had such good intentions, though, because he really wanted to provide stability and continuity for the American people when they were going through their first transfer of power. Now, it wasn't from 2 different parties, but still, most transfers of power that Americans had witnessed were accompanied by a guillotine or a revolution or a civil war or death. And it was a very scary, tense moment. And so Adams continued or decided to keep Washington's B team because he wanted to provide that continuity and that stability. And he thought that they would be loyal to the office of the president. And it turns out that they were actually really loyal to Hamilton. So that didn't go very well. But the reason I put John Adams in sort of the mixed category is because he was actually the first president to fire a secretary for basically outright insubordination. And that was really an essential precedent because it established that a president could fire a secretary, and that became a very important presidential power. Then I have Ulysses S. Grant down here at the bottom on the left. Ulysses S. Grant's cabinet actually had a lot going for it. It pursued the protection of civil rights after the end of the Civil War and tried to defend the voting rights and the civil rights of recently enfranchised African Americans. It prosecuted cases against the Ku Klux Klan. His Secretary of the Treasury was actually quite brilliant and cracked down on corruption and speculation in the gold market, which was really important. It received a little bit of a mixed grade because Grant was very loyal to the people around him and they were very loyal to him. But sometimes he had trouble seeing the flaws in his aides, and some of the corruptions and scandals that came out of that probably could have been avoided if he had a little bit clearer sense of who they were or was willing to listen to criticism against them. And then lastly, I have Eisenhower. And Eisenhower's cabinet receives really fascinating, interesting marks because Eisenhower intentionally put up this facade that he was not interested in government and he wasn't really participating and he was really delegating and he was kind of old and doddery. And most people thought that that was the case until some of his records started to get declassified. And then it became clear that he was actually super brilliant, super on top of everything, very detail oriented, knew exactly what was going on, but had put up this sort of image for political and diplomatic reasons. I give him mixed marks because John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who was the CIA director at the time, really led Eisenhower astray in a lot of ways and started a number of policies that I think still we're dealing with the ramifications of today. Then lastly, in my good category, based on those three things that we talked about with Washington, the flexibility, presidential authority, and diversity, are James Monroe up top. So James Monroe had a fascinating team of rivals. He served in the era of good feelings when there was technically only one party. There's lots of factions, but there's only one party. And his cabinet worked together really, really well until about the last year. And then they all decided to run for president against each other. And so that became a little bit calamitous. On the bottom left, of course, we have Abraham Lincoln and his team of rivals. I should say that almost every president up until Lincoln did have a team of rivals. In fact, chapter 2 of my book is called The Original Team of Rivals. But what made Lincoln most remarkable is that he was probably the least known and least qualified of all the people in his cabinet to be president, which made his sort of leadership over that group even more masterful. And then lastly, I include Obama's cabinet here because I think it's really fascinating to show the difference and the expansion of what we mean by diversity. That first picture I showed you of Washington's cabinet, as again, was the 4 white men. And as our definition of what it means to be a citizen and who gets to be included in that calculation has expanded, so too has our expectation that people of different race and gender and ethnicity and religion and background and education are included in the cabinet, which I think is entirely appropriate because it makes a president and an administration more representative of the American people. And the president is the only person who represents all Americans. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And then lastly, I like to stop to end the conversation with a pretty hilarious history story that shows that history has a sense of humor. So when my book came out, it was about a week and a half into lockdown for quarantine. And I was pretty bummed because I couldn't come up with a way to sign books for people. So I designed that sticker there. It looks like this. And they're book plates. And I can sign them for people and then I can send them to them. And I decided to include the hound on top because A, as you can see, I have a hound who I love. But Washington also loved hounds. And in fact, Washington loved hounds so much that he created the breed, the American Foxhound. He bred a series of French hounds with English hounds, and the French hounds he had received as a gift from the Marquis de Lafayette. Now, when I rescued my dog Quincy here, I did not know what breed he was, and I did one of those little DNA tests, and it turns out he is an American Foxhound. So it was meant to be. And then as I started my book tour, someone at one point said to me, Lindsay, do you know where Washington actually got those hounds? And I said, yeah, the Marquis de Lafayette gave them as a gift. And they said, but do you know who brought them over from France? And I said, no, who? And they said, John Quincy Adams. And Quincy's full name is John Quincy Dog Adams. So it was just meant to be all the way around. But anyway, that is the design of the book plate. If you have already purchased the book, thank you so much. If you are interested, it is available on Amazon or any of your favorite book buying websites. Also, any local bookstore can purchase it for you. So definitely feel free to support local businesses. And then you can go to this link that I have here and I'll drop it in the chat as well. And you can put your name and your information in, and I will send you a personalized signed book plate. Thank you for attending and for reading the book. So I am now very eager to hear your questions and chat with you about all things cabinets.
Well, Dr. Chervinsky, thank you very much. Great presentation. I did not, I mean, again, what I love about our programs is I always learn things new, and you certainly taught me a lot about cabinets and how they're formed and so forth like that. So,
Oh, well, good. Thank you.
we do have several questions to
Wonderful.
start with. And again, I would remind everybody, if you got a question, use the Q&A feature, type it in. And if you go in there and you look at some and you like it, vote for it. And those will rise to the top, and we'll make sure we get those answered. But one was a statement that we had somebody made early on. They go, well, gosh, Washington actually had his own team. It was really the first team of rivals then on something like that.
Yes, he sure did. Absolutely. I think, the difference is that Washington really had no equals at the time. He had none of his own rivals, and because he had such unparalleled stature and reputation, that they weren't rivals with him, they were just rivals with each other. So that's a little bit, I think, where the distinction comes down.
Okay. Well, Laura has a question. What is the normal amount of turnover for presidential cabinets?
This is a great question. I'm so glad that you asked this. So all presidents do have turnover. These are very demanding jobs, especially if a president is in office for 2 terms. So generally a good rule of thumb is if a president, for the big positions, especially like Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Attorney General, if they have 1 person per term, that's really great. It's pretty common for a president to have some transition if they do win the second term to have that point. I will say, just based purely on numbers, our previous administration, which ended a couple days ago, had the most turnover in US history. So what we were seeing is definitely not par for the course. And that includes 1 and 2 term, and actually 3.5 term presidents as well. So there's always some turnover. It just depends. And, it depends on the position. So for example, Theodore Roosevelt had very few secretaries of state. He had very few attorney generals. He had 6 secretaries of the Navy, I think because he liked to meddle so much, because he had been secretary of the Navy and he just couldn't leave them alone. And so none of them wanted to be in that job. So it really depends on the person, depends on the administration. But what we previously saw was definitely a little bit unusual.
Very good. Very good. Well, JD asked the question, were there any new cabinet departments proposed which were never realized? And I guess I would follow up with the question too is there an official, do they have to be approved by Congress, or can presidents form their own departments in cabinet offices?
Yeah, great question. So Congress does create new departments. So if there's going to be a new department, like the Department of Energy or the Department of Treasury, Congress does have to create that, and they establish that that is a cabinet level position. Now, there are a number of other positions that kind of bounce in and out depending on a president's preference. So the UN ambassador sometimes is cabinet level, sometimes isn't. The CIA director is sometimes cabinet level, sometimes isn't, especially after the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, which technically is supposed to oversee the CIA as well. So for example, President Biden created sort of a climate change czar. That's John Kerry. That is a new cabinet level position, but he has downgraded the CIA director to not be cabinet level. So there are a bunch on the side that are kind of up to the president, as long as they don't have an official department. There have been a number of ones that were considered and were rejected, or that were sort of reorganized. So it used to be that the Department of War, the Department of the Army, and the Department of the Navy were all separate cabinet level positions. Those are all now subsumed under the Director of Defense, or excuse me, the Department of Defense. And that is now one position. So there has been a lot of sort of reorganization as we have gone along.
Okay, very good. Well, Tina asked the question, what did you have a description or an opinion of Herbert Hoover's cabinet?
Yes. So what's really interesting about Herbert Hoover's cabinet, I will confess, I don't usually do a whole lot of reading about Herbert Hoover's cabinet, but I was doing some reading in preparation for today. And what I found most fascinating is it used to be very early on that a cabinet level position was a great jumping off point to the presidency. And then that kind of stopped for a while. And so Hoover in the middle there, when we think about sort of the late 19th, early 20th century, is sort of an aberration. And his Secretary of Commerce tenure was quite brilliant. And he was an excellent Secretary of Commerce. In terms of his cabinet management, what I discovered was that he actually didn't really like a lot of his secretaries and preferred to he established a lot of his close allies and colleagues in undersecretary positions, so that if for example, the Secretary of Treasury was Andrew Mellon, and he was very conservative, and Hoover was actually more progressive. So when he wanted to get an answer that was more in line with his position, he would go to the undersecretary. So I think that's a pretty funny cabinet dynamic that you don't always see.
Very interesting. Well, and of course, Herbert Hoover, as you said, was Secretary of Commerce for under 2 different presidents for nearly 8 years. Question is why did Warren Harding appoint Herbert Hoover as his Secretary of Commerce? And were there any other candidates for Secretary of Commerce that were vying for that same job before Hoover was named?
Yeah, so what I read was that Harding actually gave Hoover the option of being either the Secretary of Interior or the Secretary of Commerce. And the reason was because Hoover was actually very well known. He had been instrumental in the post-World War I sort of economic reconstruction efforts in Europe. He had been instrumental in dealing with trade in Asia. And so his reputation was very well established, and he had been very successful in those positions. In fact, if I might be blunt, one of the things that's sort of surprising about Hoover's presidency is all signs pointed towards just extraordinary success. And then, sometimes we can't help the hand that fate deals us. But so he had this excellent reputation, especially for financial issues. And so the Secretary of Commerce position was sort of a natural fit. And he was the one that saw it as such an opportunity to actually expand its jurisdiction and to make the Department of Commerce bigger than it was at the time.
Very good. Well, Iowa is once again, Ken Fawcett has a question that notes that Iowa is once again going to have another Iowan as Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. Now, he served 8 years under Obama. And, how many people have served under 2 different presidents in the same cabinet position? I know there has been some that have served for different presidents in different positions, but
sure,
if you could shed a little light on that, Dr. Chervinsky.
Yeah, you're right to know that is an unusual thing. That does not happen all that often. The couple of examples that I would like to point out are so in some instances where a president takes over or continues the cabinet. So for example, Johnson took over Lincoln's cabinet for obvious reasons, and he kept most of the cabinet in their same positions. But when people have come back into the cabinet, actually a couple of Hoover's cabinet secretaries went back into the cabinet for FDR, because after FDR actually had he had a really fascinating cabinet, because his first 2 terms were primarily Democrats in the cabinet. There were some progressives, some conservative Democrats, but they were very focused on the New Deal. And then when the war was sort of looming after he won his 3rd term, he basically cleaned house in the military positions, and he installed Republicans, dyed-in-the-wool Republicans that had served in several different Republican administrations, including Hoover's, so that he would have sort of bipartisan unity going into the war. And it would have only worked in those positions and because of the war, because they agreed on no economic policy. They agreed on no social policy, but they agreed about how to fight the war. And so those positions actually worked really well.
Interesting. Well, Julie has a question. She goes, can you explain how various department heads may be cabinet level office in one administration, but then be demoted in the next? And, are there any practical ramifications of such movement?
Sure. So if it's a department head, if it's a department within the administration and it is designated by legislation as cabinet level, then the president, as I said, doesn't have a whole lot of authority over that. It's the things like as I said, the UN ambassador, the CIA director, some of the Small Business Association Bureau, some of those offices that can be bumped in and out of the cabinet depending on a president's preference. Sometimes the chief of staff likes to have cabinet privileges. Sometimes they prefer not to. It just really depends on the administration. In terms of access to the president, because that's really what the cabinet is all about, I would actually argue that cabinet in this day and age, cabinet designation is really much more of an honorific and is designated to demonstrate how important a president sees an issue. So John Kerry's position was designated to show that Biden is very serious about climate change. Okay. But the cabinet meetings themselves are not really where decisions get made anymore. And they're not really where these deliberations happen anymore. And so a person's access to the president is all about their relationship or their relationship with the chief of staff or their relationship with the president's private secretary and being able to get access to them on the phone or in person. And that doesn't really have a whole lot to do with the cabinet.
Okay, very good, very good. Well, a question comes in. Did President Obama have a lot of Ivy Leaguers in his cabinet?
He did have some. I will say, overall, our federal government is sort of top heavy with people that have Ivy League credentials. And that's not really a reflection of anything that the Ivy League has done. It's just a reflection of how we value education and how we value credentials in our society. So for example, Ted Cruz is a senator from Texas, and he went to Harvard and Princeton, I think. Josh Hawley is a senator, and he went to, I think, Harvard and Yale. Either way. So, I mean, these are things where it's how we view credentials in the United States. Obama certainly had his own Ivy League credentials, but he also had plenty of people who didn't. Joe Biden is a great example of his, vice president did not have Ivy League credentials, and he was the last person in the room before every big decision. So it's definitely not a requirement.
Okay, very good. Well, Gary has a question. He says the cabinet really isn't defined in the Constitution, and the president chooses their own secretaries. Why is it so alarming when a president dismisses a cabinet member, and so forth like that? Could you make some comments on that, or maybe even point out to one that was particularly controversial?
Sure. So I think the issue is not so much the dismissal as it is the reason for the dismissal and what is the replacement function. Secretaries are designed to oversee the bureaucracies effectively and to provide advice to the president. If that relationship breaks down, then they are no longer an effective cabinet secretary, and it's entirely appropriate for there to be turnover. Typically, this might sound like kind of a duh statement, but presidents try and avoid any appearance of scandal, and they try and avoid bad headlines. So if they want someone to resign or to leave, they usually will give them the opportunity to do so in a gracious way and to arrange for a new secretary so that it looks sort of intentional and like it was, not forced on them. One of the reasons that our previous administration was a little bit different is because we did see some of those announcements on social media. And so that was, I think, a little bit jarring for some people. But again, as I said, removing someone from office is entirely appropriate. It's really, I think, the replacement issue that's important. And the reason it's so important is because the Senate is supposed to have advice and consent on those positions to ensure that the person is qualified and experienced in order to manage the department, but also qualified and experienced to give advice to the president. And that's really the American people and Congress's sole opportunity for oversight in the selection of those advisors. And so that's why it's such an important constitutional responsibility.
Okay, great. Well, we have an anonymous question, but the question is, should Calvin Coolidge have fired Hoover after President Harding had died in office and appointed his own Commerce Secretary?
That's a good question. So Coolidge kept most of Harding's secretaries. He eventually got rid of a couple, either sort of, so it's a little bit, the record is a little bit fuzzy whether or not he fired them or he again gave them the opportunity to resign and they kind of pushed back and then he made it non-optional. And those in particular were the Attorney General and then the Oh man, I can't remember the second one. I was just writing about this too, but it was people that were implicated in some of the scandals of Harding's presidency. Now, because Hoover had such a sterling reputation as being sort of an honest, upstanding person, that's why there was never really any question of Coolidge getting him out of the cabinet for that reason. They obviously didn't always agree. And I think at one point Coolidge said something like, when Hoover was running for office, he said, he's been giving me unsolicited advice for 6 years. I'm not inclined to support him now. But he managed the Commerce Department really well and did, occasionally give good advice, even if Coolidge didn't like it. So, I mean, they managed.
Very good, very good. So question is, it's an anonymous one, is did the cabinet run the country when Woodrow Wilson had his stroke and was incapacitated on there?
Yeah, it's a great question. So they continued to run the departments. They continued that function of their position, the bureaucratic. But most historians agree that the big decision-making was actually done by Edith Wilson, Wilson's wife. She was the one that was really keeping people, she and Wilson's doctor were the ones keeping people out of the room, were sort of dictating Wilson's wishes, whether or not they were actually Wilson's wishes or, what she thought he would want him to do or want them to do is a different story. But most historians agree that she was actually the one that was kind of wielding the reins of power at that point.
Interesting, interesting. We also have another question is, why did Harry Truman fire Henry Wallace? And I think Henry Wallace, was Secretary of Agriculture, if I recall.
Yeah, so Truman actually got rid of almost all of FDR's secretaries, not immediately upon taking office, but really pretty quickly, like within a couple of months. He wanted to provide a little bit of stability, but Truman actually really intended to delegate a lot. He felt like FDR was way too hands-on and way too much of a sort of nitpicker and wanted to be involved in everything. And so he intended to delegate. And so in order to be able to delegate, he really felt like he had to have people he could trust. And so he basically cleaned house with the exception of the Secretary of State, who I think then or Secretary of War, who became the Secretary of Defense, but then Truman fired him like a year later. So he pretty much cleaned house and fired everybody.
Okay, very good. Well, we're getting to the end, so I got just a couple more questions. And Andy asked, is it always the case that incoming presidents bring all new cabinet secretaries, or have there been exceptions when an outgoing president's secretary is retained for back-to-back cabinets? And I would almost piggyback on that too, is have you seen very many where a secretary is renamed to the cabinet from differing parties? In other words, maybe a Democrat is outgoing, Republican comes in, and one is kept on something like that.
Yes, actually, more than you would think. It's kind of become standard, at least in the 21st century, for presidents to have one at the end of the 20th and the beginning of the 21st century to have one secretary from the opposing party. So, for example, Ronald Reagan appointed Lauro Cavazos, who was the Secretary of Education. He stayed on through part of H.W. Bush's presidency, and he was a Democrat. Obama kept Robert Gates, who had been George W. Bush's defense secretary. Technically he was nonpartisan because he's military, but he probably is Republican. Let's see, there are some other examples. So George W. Bush, actually Norman Mieda was the first actually Asian American secretary. He had served under Clinton as the Secretary of Commerce, and George W. Bush kept him on as the Secretary of Transportation. So there have been some examples where people have been kept on because they've been either a valuable person or they feel that they can work in a bipartisan fashion.
Okay, very good. Well, and we'll make this the last question before we wind up, but Mark had it in chat. He says, do you ever rate who were the best secretaries of their respective departments on that? In other words, is there somebody that was just the best Secretary of State or the best Secretary of War or Treasury or like that? And I wouldn't ask you to name all of them, but maybe two or three that really stood out.
Yeah, I haven't done like a whole scale study, but I will say that there are a couple. John Quincy Adams was, I am biased because I really enjoy studying John Quincy Adams, but he was a phenomenal Secretary of State. I think that and then his later congressional career are really the peaks of his public service career. And then in terms of Another great Secretary of State, actually, and also one of the all-time great names, is Hamilton Fish, who was Ulysses S. Grant's Secretary of State. It's just such a stellar name. I love it very much. And then let's see, what are some of having trouble thinking of some of the more recent ones. Actually, I would say, so he's not a very well-known one, but Amos Ackerman was Ulysses S. Grant's second Attorney General, and he was the first that had control of the DOJ and really built out what the Department of Justice was supposed to be, which is that it's supposed to defend the civil rights of the most vulnerable. And he amazingly had been in the Confederate Army and then turned radical Republican afterwards, and then had this incredible career of prosecuting the Ku Klux Klan and establishing civil rights. And so I think that's a pretty remarkable story.
Interesting. Well, and we could go on and on and on, Dr. Chervinsky, but your presentation has just been terrific. And obviously the book, I would think a lot of listeners would probably be interested. As you said, you could get it at Barnes and Noble, Amazon, or your favorite bookstore. And I do know in the chat that Dr. Chervinsky has also offered a book plate on that too. So just go to Lindsay Chervinsky.com on that and pick that up. So I guess that's really all the time we have for questions now. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Chervinsky, for joining us tonight in an excellent presentation. And we do want to get you out to West Branch.
Oh, well, thank you. I look forward to it.
And we start circulating again. We'd love to have you out here. And we
will.
Will.
Thank you. Thank you all so much again for being here. And I look forward to meeting you all in person at some point in the future.
Okay, very good. And again, I'd like to thank the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library Museum and the Herbert Hoover National Historic Site, and all of the public libraries help make tonight's program a success. And on the Hoover campus, the Presidential Library Museum, as I mentioned, and also the National Park Service Visitor Center remain closed, but 4 of the historical buildings are open 9 to 5 daily. If you would like to come to West Branch, we'd love to have you. Now, the Hoover Presidential Foundation staff is here daily, ready to assist you with your membership needs or charitable gifts in support of the Hoover campus. Just call us or email us with any needs that you may have. And don't forget about next month's third Thursday program titled Lincoln, Race, and the Challenge of Self-Government. Obviously, we'll be around Abraham Lincoln's birthday, so it'll be very timely. And the links are now open on our website and Facebook pages to register. And on behalf of all of us here at the Hoover campus and the participating public libraries, we thank you for joining us and look forward to your next visit to the Hoover campus. Good evening.